how important you guys have been to us. You all represent a different part of our life, and we love it. And we love you guys deeply. I want to recognize Mike's uncle, Russell. And would you mind telling us how young you are, sir?
98.
We got some genes going here. Also, I think I did introduce my family, but I don't think I was as sincere about it as I should have been. All right, everyone cut me up. But what I'd like to, they're kind of moving on. I would like very much to move. I would like very much to introduce someone very special. His name is Dr. Phil Gilbert, and he wants to speak to you, tell you a story. He was the flight surgeon when Mike took off with the flu health.
Well, actually, the Navy paid for my last year of medical school, so I was going to be in for a while. My dad gave me a sword when I joined the Navy. They'd been in the Navy for a long period of time. And I interned at the U.S. Naval Hospital in San Diego. And I went to Pensacola. And I went through flight school in Pensacola, soloed in the T-34. And after I got through that, I went back to San Diego and was assigned to K-57 in a helicopter squadron, which was named HS-2. And they were first time that those helicopters had gone on carriers. They normally helicopters, when the sun went down, they sort of went down. But these were all-weather helicopters, and our squadron was going to be the first ones to fly these helicopters on the West Coast. We had 50 pilots in the squadron, and Mike was one of the pilots in the squadron on HS-2. And he probably was one of the best pilots, if not the best pilot in that squadron. He was extremely brilliant, extremely coordinated, and so pleasant and so bright that, any job that the CO gave him, he did just marvelously well. And I used to fly with Mike because he was such a good pilot. And believe me, I picked a pilot for that fly with. So I want a certain item which I feel very close to my heart. And her only request is that after you establish that it was you that made the call of wisdom to transport Mike to Triplet Hospital, that God was in charge. I might be repeating myself during our conversation in your home, but the vast majority of the 66 people that have answered our call to come to the event have not heard this story, or maybe only sketches. We've never been ashamed of the experience, but most people don't want to go too deep, and this was an incredible event in our lives, and one that is still filled with great emotion and such gratitude to God. He just wasn't finished with our Mike yet. Again, I repeat, we had a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you telling the story. They also told me that their daughters really haven't heard this story. So I found that quite interesting, and it was very indelibly etched in my mind too. So we go to the night of October '63 on the 2nd. Mike had been officer of the day. Officer of the day means that he's in control of the area where people come on board the ship and leave the ship. He's in control of anything that happens, and is responsible for anything that might be having to be pushed up to the CO of the ship, any event that was bad. We were on the hook in Hawaii. In other words, we were on anchor. We were not docked to anything. We were floating out in the middle. So I was not on duty that night, and I did not go to shore with some of my friends who had invited me, but I just stayed in the wardroom. And one of the other officers came down and said, "Mike has been drinking and he's drunk up in his room." And I said, "What did you say?" He said, "Well, Mike's been drinking and he's drunk up in his room." I said, "Mike doesn't drink, he doesn't take drugs. I'm going right up." I went up to Mike's room. He was indeed in his room, very incoherent, and sort of thrashing around. And I asked him one question. I said, Mike, do you have a headache? Oh, yeah, I got kind of a really bad headache. So I said, all right, we're going to get a boat. We'll get the officers' personnel boat. We're going to load you on that boat. We're going into shore. There'll be an ambulance there, and we're taking you to Tripler Hospital. So we did that. We got to Tripler Hospital. I took him into the emergency room. I did a spinal tap, which was very elevated. I took a couple of drops out of the spinal tap and looked at it under a microscope, and there was blood in there. So my diagnosis at that time was he had a Berry aneurysm. This is a congenital thing that people get, and it's a little stalk-like thing that comes off of a blood vessel, usually the artery. It has a little berry on the top, and the berry ruptures, and it causes a hemorrhage inside the brain. So I had them call the Tripler, as you know, is an Air Force officer. So I had them call the colonel. He wasn't in the Navy, and I asked him to come in to see me. And so while I was doing the spinal tap, they came back into the room, and they said, the colonel will be in the morning. So I said, will you call the colonel back and get me the phone? So when he came back on the line, I said, Colonel, this is Lieutenant Gilbert, USN. I said, one of my best, if not the best pilots in my squadron is here. He's had a brain hemorrhage. And if you're not here in 30 minutes, you're going to be several ranks lower than you are now. So he showed up fairly quickly, actually. And the important thing in these hemorrhages, when they have them, is that the mortality in those was very high at that time. There was a lot of problems in which way they should treat them. Should they just leave them alone and see if they rebleed, which really wasn't a proper way because about 30% of them rebled and had very serious problems. Should they tie off, there's a little circle of vessels around the bottom of the brain called the circle of Willis, so you tie off the carotid artery on the side where the aneurysm was, and that would lower the pressure in that aneurysm. But they didn't do very well either. So one of the newer techniques was try to keep them for a while, stabilize them, and then go into the brain with microsurgical techniques. You have to go through some parts of the brain, and you clip the little stalk of the aneurysm, and that really increased their survival rate. But that was just in its infancy then, and not a lot of people were doing these techniques. So anyway, he made it through the night. You know, I left there at about 1 o'clock at night, and you have to give these patients something to lower the blood pressure. You have to pack them in ice. You have to sort of put them in a coma. And then I had to call his wife. Now, she remembers that I said he's been in an accident. But I remember very distinctly what I told her that night. But, you know, the Navy wives live in mortal fear of that moment when you got to receive a call and their husband's been in an aircraft accident, because a lot of those don't end well. So she remembers that I said what I said to her was he's had a vascular accident. And she remembers, you know, that he was in an accident, so she didn't know what it was. So I said, you need to come immediately. As soon as you can, you need to get here. And she said, well, you know, I'm 7 months pregnant, and I'm not sure I can fly. I said, well, I think you can fly, but call your obstetrician tonight, get his permission, he'll tell you whether he thinks it's safe or not, and then you get here as quick as you can, which she did. So she got there, and of course, you know, he's in a coma, and it's kind of a serious thing. She also remembers that she was, on that little questionnaire that she had, that she was asked to go down and sign a death certificate. Well, even in those days, and possibly way back before that, no family member can sign a death certificate. That is either a physician or the coroner. So what they asked her to sign was a power of attorney to do not resuscitate. So they, you know, so many of those patients died that they wanted her to sign a do not resuscitate letter, so that if he did look like he was going to die, that they didn't have the need to resuscitate. She wouldn't sign it, which was very appropriate. So after a few days, and he was in a coma, not doing one thing or the other, you know, the ship left and I left. And I had to go with the ship. I was the senior flight surgeon at that time for the aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. So we sailed off, and she was there with Mike for several weeks. And then they decided that he hadn't died, so they decided to transfer him back to Travis Air Force Base in the States, and they flew him back there. Once he got there, they transferred him to the U.S. Naval Hospital in San Diego, where the chief of neurosurgery was Dr. Sam Assen. Now, Sam was from South Dakota, and I'm from South Dakota. So when I was an intern there, I knew Sam very well. And Sam was very brilliant, and he was already doing the microsurgical techniques. So he had to sit Ann down and say, you know, we're going to go through brain tissue here. He may not be the same person when he wakes up. He won't be able to talk, maybe. He won't be able to hear. I can't be sure of what's going to happen to him when I do the surgery, but it's definitely going to increase his chance and save his life. So Sam did the surgery. Now, after the surgery, I mean, if you want to talk about it, it kind of breaks me up, but a loving wife, there she is. Her husband came back, and he couldn't talk. He'd pick up a fork and stick it in his ear. I mean, he was, you know, uncoordinated. She spent months in going through rehabilitation with him to make him the person that he is today. So, to me, it's a love story. It's a wonderful love story. And to think that God didn't have a hand in some of this was, to me, being a physician, I see God all the time. So now the next part of the story goes on. Mike rehabilitates, gets back most of his brilliance. He goes before a board, and he wants to go back to a squadron and fly again. Got a piece of metal in his head where they did the surgery. So he goes before the board, which consisted of a doctor and 2 line officers. The doctor said, no, you can't fly. The line officers loved Mike, you know, he's just charming, very brilliant, and they said, he can fly. Now, God works again, so God says, Philip, you're going to get transferred. So I got out of HS2. They asked me to stay in for another year. I had a residency in ophthalmology, which I started in 65, but I had an extra year to put in, or they wanted me to stay an extra year. So they sent me to the replacement air group squadron, HS10. Now, they would send pilots to HS10 who were coming back to the squadron to be retrained to go to various squadrons. So Mike came back to the squadron, HS10, to be retrained and to continue to fly and go into one of the other squadrons, HS2, HS6, HS8. And I looked at him, I called him into the office and I said, Mike, I can't let you fly. I said, I know what you've gone through, but it's not safe for you to fly, so I'm not going to give you an up to fly. Well, if you want to see crestfallen, you should have seen his face that day. So a week later, he was playing handball in a handball court, and he had a convulsion. So can you imagine what would have happened if I would have said it was okay for you to fly, and he had a convulsion in the cockpit of an aircraft, going in for a landing or flying or doing something. So they sent him to a desk job in HS2, and of course Mike, if he couldn't fly, he didn't really want to do that. So he got out, became a teacher, got his master's degree, and became a wonderful teacher. And has lived his life as you've seen through these pictures. So if you don't see God working in this scenario, well, that's okay for you, but I see him working a lot, many times in medicine, and he certainly worked with me and Mike during that. So that's the story.
Thank you. Okay, here's another guy, another wonderful person. His name is Taylor Hartman, and his wife Jean.